Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this conversation interview with Nick Gaitan, singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and many other things besides, who's from Houston, Texas. The interview is taking place in the Jefferson Building of the U.S. Library of Congress on September 24th, 2025. I'm Guha Shankar, Senior Folklife Specialist here at the American Folklife Center, and it's a distinct privilege to have this chance to get Nick to talk to us about growing up in the amazingly diverse and rich musical soundscape of Houston and lots of other things besides. A few words about Nick, in case you haven't had a chance to look at his bio in many, many different sites online. He makes music rooted in Houston's East End and broader Gulf Coast Tejano and honky-tonk, blues and conjunto, rockabilly and soul musics. He's a master of the tololoche, the double Mexico's signature version of the double bass, as well as the electric bass, which I've seen you play and which you have on stage behind me. We'll talk about that in a minute. He's played with legendary musicians, if I might overuse that word, including Billy Joe Shaver, Los Carnales out of Houston, Texas, and I believe you're going on tour with Nicky Hill very shortly, if that is correct.
Yes, we're off the road at the moment, and I'm always touring with Nicky Hill the last 8 years. Yeah,
fantastic. Nick is also an active Latino music scholar and historian, working to celebrate, explore, and preserve the cultures and musics and sounds that have shaped him. And not only that, Nick has also served as an interviewer for the project Sonidos de Houston, documenting the city's Chicano music scene, which was selected as a 2022 awardee of the AFC's Community Collections Grant, which seeks to document the contemporary Chicano music community in Houston. And tonight, for those of us here in DC, we will get the privilege of watching him and listen to him and give us his musical experiences with his band in a program called Tejas Roots Music from Houston and the historic Coolidge Auditorium. And Nick, I wanted to emphasize the historicity of the Coolidge Auditorium because right here on this very stage in about 1934, I believe, Alan Lomax, preeminent musicologist and ethnomusicologist, recorded the sounds of Jelly Roll Morton, one of your musical heroes, I believe.
That's
right.
Is
that correct?
Absolutely, that is correct. I love me some Jelly Roll Morton. And, John Nova Lomax, rest in peace, was Alan Lomax's great nephew, and he was a friend of mine from down in Houston and has written about me plenty in my path, my musical path.
No degrees of separation here at the Library of Congress, I must say.
That's right.
So let me begin just by asking you, tell us something about yourself. Who are your people? Where are you from? I mean, I read your bio. It says you grew up in Houston. Tell me what that was like.
Sure. Well, I was born, I'm a native Houstonian. My parents are both from Houston. My dad was born in Laredo and moved there at 6. Mm-hmm. Mom was born in Houston, in 2nd Ward. My family is Mexican American, and my grandfathers on both sides were Mexican nationals. My grandfather Gaitan was from Dolores Hidalgo, Guanajuato, and my grandfather Fermin Treviño, my mother's dad, was born in Monterrey, I believe. But I know he was from Mexico, but it's one of those things where we're not quite sure on some of that, but I believe that's the case. Some accounts say Laredo, Texas, and I'm not quite sure. We're figuring that one out. But my family, for the most part, we are all Houstonians. I was born in St. Joseph's Hospital right there in downtown. A very East End upbringing. Grandfather, working class. My grandfather was a mechanic, known in the neighborhood by many. My mother and all of her siblings grew up in that East End area off of Navigation, right off the Buffalo Bayou. And just, living day-to-day, working, life. And my dad growing up right down the street in some project homes called Clayton Homes. He went on to go join the Marine Corps during the Vietnam era, and he was a combat veteran, and in 66, 67. Well, the family, as he returned from war, they got married, started a family. Well, we've moved further southeast in Houston, which, if anybody knows anything about Houston, there's the ship channel that made us the big megalopolis that it is. And, well, that's where everybody meets. That diversity is so important there. We're all walks of life, wayfarers, just workers, dock workers, everything. is just, it's everybody from everywhere. And Houston is so international and diverse that it's just natural for us to adapt to others' customs that aren't our own so much, but we belong to each other. That's the nature of that city. Right. So that turns, that's the result of my art, that's the result of my music, and I feel like it's my entire, you know, it's what makes me. Houston is so important, and I don't know how I got so lucky to be from there.
Well, we're all lucky that you're lucky, so thanks for that. So you've just given me an opening to ask you then about your earliest, you know, you talk about all these influences that are a part of Houston. Where does music fit in, and how does it start for you back in the day?
I love that. My family, there's not a lot of musicians in my family, but there's a lot of music lovers. And growing up in my house, you heard tons of soul music, Motown, Stax and Volt. You've heard lots of country music, like the old stuff, you know, we're talking young Willie Nelson, you're talking, you know, everything from before that. I mean, just 50s, 60s on, Ray Price, you know, everybody hearing a jukebox that plays 45s. Mom listened to country, she listened to rancheras, she listened to, both my parents met at a place called the Pan American Ballroom, which was, in our interviews, a lot of these musicians would have played there at those times that my parents met. Well, they met during a matinee show, so they met at a place that matches, it's weird the way this puzzle gets put together, but where they met fits my entire musical interest, and it kind of sits where my heart's at. So, and these are these things we learn, we see the pictures, and we know that Little Joey, La Familia, or the Latinaires were playing these places. Sonny and the Sunliners were playing there. Everybody who was in the music genre of La Onda Chicana, which eventually turned into what we call Tejano music, was starting off there when they were younger people. So these things all fit into the narrative. And so that's where music comes into my life. Now, just being in a house that's so musical like that, we were introduced to so much. So there was not just one side to it. I mean, I could tell what mood or where my father's heart was at by what he was listening to. I could tell when I woke up on Saturdays if he was in a heavier mood or a lighter mood or sentimental, because Jose Alfredo Jimenez would be on the radio, and I'd smell the barbecue out back, or just he could hear a soul song and would tell me the exact moment that he remembers that song being released. So I grew up with this type of thing where I would just go cruise with him, and there was always a story with a song. Somewhere along the line, by the time I picked up a guitar, I was in that same mood as he was with music. So that's the way it always has been approached with me. You know, it's very personal.
Speaking to that kind of musical background that you had, did you find that to be unusual among your peers when you were growing up? I mean, were you the only kid who was experiencing music in this way, or were there others like yourself out there in Houston?
I feel like the more people you meet, the more you realize how much you have in common with this story. And of course, as we grow and we share with other musicians and we begin to talk about our influences, somebody might ask each other, well, how do you know about Lightning Hopkins, or how do you know about, you know, Juke Boy Bonner? And well, my mom turned me on to it, or it started because I started listening to Willie Nelson because my mother loved Willie Nelson, and then I learned. So I feel like it wasn't unusual. But of course, when you're experiencing something for the first time like that, you think that, you know, wow, this is a unique story. But it's more common than we think. We're fortunate whenever we have that story. Hard to say how unique or how common it is, but it's there. Right. It's there because it's one thing that a lot of me and my fellow musicians that we share the stage and share the road with, we all come with our own stories. What I do like about it is the difference happens whenever your friends are from a different region, because we have regional heroes. Even though the internet is everywhere now, there are still regional sounds like Tejano music and swamp pop and country. They all exist in the Gulf Coast, and there's a certain sound when it's coming from here. Meanwhile, if we move to another region, my friends from North Carolina will tell me different stories about their influences, like their rock and roll influence or their soul influences. You know, Link Ray or Stax and Volt. You know, you're closer to Tennessee, you're closer to Memphis. And then there's these major musical hubs that come out of there. Like a lot of times they were old studios. Houston, for example, was Gold Star Studios, which became Sugar Hill. Memphis, you have stacks, you have this other history, which was another whole other part of soul. So that part changes. You know, there's a few moving parts in there.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. One of the things that you've sort of touched upon is your mother's listening to rancheras. Obviously, other musicians from that area are listening to like schottisches and waltzes from the Czech and the German backgrounds, and so there's all of this amalgamation of music going on. But just so, because we have you on record as a scholar of some note, how about parsing the difference between, say, Tejano, Chicano music for one thing, and then if you can break that down for us a little bit.
I can. Well, to give you a frame of that, I'm a late 70s model. So being born as a very young kid, elementary school age through the 80s, they were starting to call it Tejano back then. So I just thought that's what it was called whenever you had Mexican Americans playing this music in English and Spanish. But what I learned was that, and I learned this through some of these interviews that we've been doing, some of the older guys that were singing in the 60s, they would tell us, we didn't call it Tejano back then. We started calling that whenever people started wearing cowboy hats and stuff, because they went from the orquesta and conjunto, which joined together and made that sound, which ended up being what we refer to as Tejano. And from the horn section went into the organ. The horn section turned into an organ to replace that in some cases, and then in some cases it went to the accordion. The bajo sexto was traded off for a guitar in some cases. So the music would change just depending on what that band was trying to achieve with their sound, from what I understand. But as far as like what we're labeling it as, what I was told, and this makes a lot of sense, is they started calling it Tejano at a different era. And so the difference is just the way the music has evolved and changed over time, but it's all from the same root. Conjunto, of course, is a stripped down version where you have a tololoche and you have a bajo sexto and an accordion. Meanwhile, orquesta, just like it sounds, is an orchestra full of horns, and they have the bandstand thing going on, and the band leader, Neto Perez, big bands like this, down there at a different time when that's what people were going to see. Then, your 80s Tejano, you brought in the synthesizer because that's what was hot at the time. That's what was happening. These instruments, one would take the lead over another era's instrument. But then at some point, somebody brings something back all the time. Nothing ever goes out of fashion, for that matter. Like you might, just like they switched from the upright bass to the electric in the 50s, it was mostly because they didn't want to strap the upright bass on the top of their car to get across town, and it might fall off or it might rain or anything like that. And plus, who wants to carry that elephant around, But that's the way it goes. Right. And then years later, somebody says, no, man, there's no mistaking that sound, and that's the thump I want. Let me have that upright bass, and you bring it back. So nothing's ever expired, nothing's ever out of fashion.
So how does soul, I know Houston has a majority in African-American population, and a lot of influences going through there from the Gulf Coast and all that. So how does soul enter the picture in terms of your, what have you found out about that?
I love this question. Oh, man. Okay, so my parents, like I said, they grew up and they met dancing and stuff, and then so did so many people of our generation's parents that were meeting in these social places. Soul is just big, and African American influence on music and just the culture in general, from everything that we know today as popular music, rock and roll, all of that is because of that path. So Black and Brown in Houston was happening. Like they were listening to soul music. Because I asked my dad before and my mom, you listen to a lot of soul music. Did y'all listen to Spanish music too? He said, well, sure we did, but man, we were jamming Smokey and the Miracles. We were jamming all of this other stuff that was happening with Motown. So soul was always there, and I think. And that's also what was on the radio, and that's what people were going out and hanging out to. So it's never been out of the picture. But what bands would do, what I learned that Chicano bands would do, is some of their sides of their records were soul, and then you flip them, and then there'd be a polka, a ranchera, a waltz, And of course that influence came from the other side. We didn't get the accordion out of nowhere. It didn't come out of thin air. It came from another history that has a whole other story of people moving into Texas and bringing their influences. But back to soul. Soul has never been out of the equation, and it continues to stay in there. I mean, even a more modern Tejano band, that's playing that genre will still use an old soul song. It's just in the mix. It was built into Chicano music.
Right. So that was one of the things I wanted to get you to talk about was a project, Houston's Sonidos de Houston project, is very specifically geared at exposing or uncovering or making visible all of these kinds of musical influences.
Yeah.
And to that extent, you said something fascinating earlier about the fact that, Zydeco came to you on the highway or through the highway. What did you mean by that? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Oh man, I get excited talking about it. Well, okay. I call it the Orion's Belt of the Gulf Coast. Okay. you have New Orleans, Lafayette area.
Right.
They're far enough from each other to be two distinct places, of course. Then they're very special in their own right. You have let's just start with New Orleans, right? And then you have Houston, and then you have San Antonio. So you have 3 dots on the map, all connected by I-10. But before I-10 was there, it was Highway 90 that people were getting down this Gulf Coast road. The music is connected by the highway because these truck drivers and everybody else traveling through, because people were moving to Texas for the oil business and all of this stuff. Well, music was traveling, truckers were coming through, and just musicians were traveling, be it the Chitlin circuit or, I mean, was there one for Mexicanos? I don't know. Was there, another circuit that they call? I don't know.
Right.
But it was probably the same one. But Swamp Pop out of Louisiana sounds like West Side San Antonio. It is the exact same music to me. And that's why you'll hear Sonny and the Sunliners cover Lloyd Price's Just Because. That's why you'll hear different other Matilda. Matilda is a song out of Lake Charles, Louisiana, written by the Kings of Swamp Pop, Cookie and the Cupcakes. You'll hear that same song in San Antonio, in Houston, and in New Orleans, played by Chicanos, African Americans, anybody in that mix. Because again, we share everything of our musical traditions there. Nobody says you can't play this because you're this or that. That's our flavor. That's our seasoning. That was the connection of the highway there. And then I make the reference to the 3 stars in the sky. And it's just something cool I thought about. And I just really love that, But it's an important thing to me to show that there's so much more. And one thing that echoes in these projects and echoes in my band, I have some excellent musicians that we love to share so many thoughts with each other beyond music. And there's so much more that connects us, that unites us, than that sets us apart. And that's a beautiful part of that, of our musical culture and our traditions.
Well, beautifully said. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
So, continuing that thread of sort of this highway, if you will.
Yes.
You did an interview, I think, with Joyce.
Joyce Day.
Joyce Day.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about how her father would go from, and you asked her a question, and she says, my father would play in his band at his club, and then he'd go to the ports at night around 1 or 2 after he finished his gigs, and he'd be talking and playing music with merchant seamen and other people who came in off the boats. And I thought, and then you said something about port cities, and I didn't quite, I'm still trying to unpack that particular reference to port cities around the world. That's really fascinating. That's
so exciting. All right, so take any port city, like Houston, right? Joyce's family. Her dad would play the gigs and then go down to the port. And who was at those ports? Wayfarers, travelers, musicians, people coming in that are working on the docks that also just happen to find this other life in this other place. That's where mixes happen. That's where Buenos Aires has tango. They have their tango, and they're speaking a slang that's called lunfardo, that's based on Italian language, and it's sort of like a slang, a different vernacular that we would use over here in English, but it's their own, and it's something that can only be done in that place because that's a very special port. You can't create another place like Buenos Aires in Houston, nor could you do the thing vice versa. New Orleans is another place. This is why they call it where jazz was created, you know. And we can split those hairs all day long, and some are going to agree and some are not. Just like rock and roll. Did it happen in Memphis? Did it happen in Houston? You know, there's always going to be that. We pick those things apart. It's really entertaining, and it's really just a cool thing that happened. But port cities to me are magical. Being from one, I have a song that I wrote in my first album called Neptunes in the Bayou. And I think the notion that my heart wanted to say was that just Houston was so international that the God of the sea connects us all, you know what I mean? And that happens through music, and it happens through these things that, you know, sometimes we can explain and sometimes we just can't. Sometimes we just roll with it. There's people that were pulling up in New Orleans and grabbing a clarinet or a trumpet and stuff and just joining the group and then adding their own influence to it, you know. That's why Jelly Roll Morton said you have to have, for jazz, you have to have that Spanish tinge, he referred to it as. That kind of thing happens just like in Houston when you hear a Chicano band playing. You're gonna hear that African-American influence from the soul. You're gonna hear that German influence of the accordion or the Czechs, you know, the Polish. Polish were big, you know, they're big in Texas too, Houston particularly too, on the north side of Main. Main Street there, you know, there's an old club that used to be around called Fitzgerald's. It was a Polish dance hall. So see, people are coming from all angles of this thing, and the accordion was the common denominator of that, you know. So, and who, they all play waltzes, they all play polkas. Well, Mexicanos picked that up, and then we turned it into our own. And then generations later, you have folks that speak less Spanish. Maybe we've been here 3 or 4 generations now, and that's just the way we grew up. We're still playing those accordions. We might just be telling our stories in more English than Spanish, or in, like I say, in my broken Tex-Mex sometimes, you know, I sing any way I want, and it's gonna sound good, and I'm gonna have fun doing it and telling my story, because that is my story. So that's the connecting part for me.
Fantastic. So going back again to
Sure.
in the 70s, you started picking up on music. What was the first musical instrument you started playing? Was it always the bass, or was
well,
it
see, I was born in the 70s, the late 70s, but when I started playing guitar, it was in the 90s. I was a 14-year-old kid in high school. Yeah, so I was just out the gate in 79. But then my first instrument that I was playing was my guitar. My grandfather had a guitar he would hang over his bed, and he would bring it out every now and then. We wanted him to sing. I used to have asthma as a kid, so I would spend my sick days over there with my grandparents, and I'd get him to sing and play. He would do that. It was really entertaining. He would sing us this song called The Umbrella Man back in the day. And it was a 1930s song that was like recorded by, you know, Sammy Kaye or somebody like that. I always thought he wrote that song until I found it on the record. I was like, oh, he didn't. But Grandpa played guitar, and at some point as a teenager, you know, your friends are rocking. We're all listening to the music at the time was like a lot of alternative music in the 90s. You know, that movement was happening. And I was like, well, man, I want to play a guitar. I remember I was walking in the hallway, and I saw this kid. He was the older kid than me. He was in 8th grade. I was in junior high, and he was just jamming out on this acoustic guitar. And I said, man, I want to do that. And then that led me to starting to go to pawn shops, you know, places that my parents told me not to go into, you know. Oh, you don't want to go over there. That's just a bunch of junk or whatever. Well, I wanted to find me a guitar because I wanted to play guitar now. That I saw the guy made it look so easy that I said, well, I could do that. And that was the first instrument I picked up. I was in 9th grade, and I started my first band as a 9th grader in Milby High School, and that's in Southeast Houston, you know. And that turned into 4 years of just being kicking around in my bedroom, and whoever's parents would let us jam in their garage. To then at 19 years old, I was a sophomore in college, and I really wanted to play the upright bass, you know. And at that time, it was because I loved to listen to Charles Mingus playing jazz. I loved to listen to Willie Dixon play blues, you know. That is where music took off for me, because then I started getting gigs, and it wasn't just me looking out my window playing my guitar anymore. I was like, man, this is a thing that I'm nervous to do, and I have to do it now, because it started getting really addictive, you know.
So did you take formal lessons, or was it just, were there people like mentoring you or teaching you?
I'm self-taught. Wow. I'm self-taught. When I picked up the guitar, one of the funny things that happened is I got home from school one day, and my friend Caesar had found a book on the street because he saw that I would sit there in my window and play guitar. My mom says, your friend Caesar dropped off this book. He says he found it in the street. And it was like, books back then for that kind of thing were like $20. And I was a broke teenager. Of course, I didn't have that, $20. So this is great. So that's when I learned my chords. So
what was the book?
It was just rhythm guitar. It was just a plain old book with chord pictures. And that's when I started learning chords. And that started me on the path of the guitar. Because we didn't have all these resources that we have on the internet now. I mean, YouTube, you can learn just about anything anywhere now. But I learned those initial chords and started learning some songs. I was, growing up listening to a lot of classic rock. My brother was a big musical influence on me as far as what he would listen to. He's not a musician, but he always showed me music. Check this out. And we were listening to a lot of classic rock, The Doors, Black Sabbath, stuff like that. Like so many other kids in the U.S.,
all great Tejano musicians.
That's right. And you know what? That is a common thing. It's funny. There are lots of American influence as us hyphenated Americans, right? Like we have that American influence is plugged right in. We're listening to American music. We're in our American culture. We're just bringing these other things with us that come from our history, that come from our genetic memory in our souls,
So here you are jamming out to Black Sabbath and Tommy Iommi and whomever else and Jim Morris and all that. Mm-hmm. When does the kind of the Chicano part of it start entering into your repertoire? Is it a conscious decision that you make, or is it something you just sort of found naturally?
Wow, yeah. So it was always around. Mm-hmm. Okay, the neighborhood that I come from is called Pecan Park, and it's in Southeast Houston. Again, working class, families living there, people living their lives, going to work on the docks. At these docks we talk about, where people come in off the ships and do their thing historically throughout the years of Houston, through its birth. Music was always in the neighborhood. Whether it be, in the 90s, there was a culture of where we would blast our, people were just jamming their music for the whole neighborhood to hear. Well, you'd hear these polka rhythms, and you'd see your older siblings talking to their friends about this song or this thing. So it was always around us. Where did it become a part of my music? It started becoming a part of my musical practice whenever I joined the band that you mentioned earlier, Los Cardenales. Los Cardenales was my first gig as a musician on a stage outside of like high school talent shows and all of that. And they are now what I refer to as like a Houston institution. I mean, so many musicians that are from Houston have played in that band and then gone on to do other things or stayed in the band for years. That was my first gig on upright. I had been playing about 6 months, and I did an audition, and then the rest was just trying to keep up with the gig so I can keep getting better. Well, I held the gig for a good while until I decided to leave the band. We split up. The band still exists, and we're all still tight, friends and everything. They introduced me to a part of my culture that I needed to know about so much more than I was getting. Like, the neighborhood, you just see, this is a common thing to feel and to hear the music of Tejano music, because we're in Houston. I mean, it's right there. Chicano and Tejano, that being the same thing for this context. But when I joined Los Cardenales, then we were playing for more Mexican audiences. We were going to Mexico. We were singing in Spanish, but we were playing Jamaican music.
You're playing ska.
Ska, because Cardenales, and ska is the music of Jamaican independence. Right. How did I go from not knowing a thing about it to jumping right into a band and playing on an upright bass, which was the original bass of the Skatalites, Lloyd Brevitt, one of my influences, right there. I mean, 1952, I don't know when the Skatalites started, but it was upright bass that they were doing with all them horns. They were orchestra instruments. And of course, when you break it down and you dissect ska, you have American R&B, you have rhythm and blues, and you have mento music, which mento is not calypso. Calypso is more Trinidad, right? Well, mento is the Jamaican, something close to that, where they have the rumba box, they have the guitars, acoustic. It's a folky music. You put those together, it's the same thing that happened with conjunto music and orquesta. It created something else because it's a hybrid.
And the Skatalites are still playing at the ages of 70s and 80s even today.
It's amazing. It's amazing how long they've lasted and keep on going. And it's a legacy now. It's kind of like when you catch like a band like Trio Los Panchos, their Mexican traditional trio with guitars, And if people pass on, I mean, some of them gotten old and passed away, then you hire another person in that place, and the legacy continues. But it has to be a high pressure situation, because you can't just be anybody walking on the Scatolites, and be like, I want to be a Scatolite, So, but I have to say that's where Los Carnales introduced me to a part of my culture that I was less exposed to, and then I grew so much in those years of my early 20s because I needed to, and life put me there. So then I was traveling to Mexico. We didn't go to Mexico when we were kids. I mean, my family's all over here probably since the 50s, I mean, I can't think of a Mexican cousin, like a Mexican national we didn't go. I was jealous of my friends that would go visit their grandma for the summer or something. Well, my grandma was in Second Ward. They were right down the street. I mean, you just have to follow the coffee smell. The Maxwell house was over there, and then we ended up in Second Ward, and I get to go see my parents' parents, and who were also music lovers. So man, this something in my genetic memory shook something up, and I just took the ride.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's a great memory of the Maxwell House floating down the.
You smell it from distance, man. Yeah.
But there's one part of the interviews that you're doing in which you talk extensively about brown power, the brown berets and brown power, and the Chicanismo, the movement of Chicanismo, and that influence it had, which is also, as you say in your interviews, it's an important part of musical identity for young Houstonians and young Tejanos in Houston, right?
That is important. We see all the things that happen in life, and everybody that can read a book or watch the news sees how people were treated at different times of our existence. And then these things, they have another way of orbiting around and showing their head again. Well, we always have been taught in our generation to be proud of who we were. And previous generations were told not to speak Spanish. So some of us grew up speaking all English, for what? I mean, we'd be so much more ahead if we knew more languages, but that's the culture that sometimes we're born into. Well, you always have an opportunity to consciously take a hold of your destiny and do that. So when there are voices out there giving power to our people, it's something that you can really sink your teeth into and look in that mirror and see people that look like you and say, we can do this. We can be strong. We can be proud of who we are. There's no shame in this. Give it all, and be powerful. Love is powerful. We have to do this in a way that it helps other people grow, and not the ugly side of power. Because clearly there is. Right.
So, and then brown power comes into your repertoire, and then through Los Carnales and other bands like that?
Yeah, it does. And then also just other influences. A lot of times when I think about that, I think of the audience coming that was responding to the music. So you will meet your brown beret friends and your people that are part of this other side of the movement that are I don't want to call it non-musical, but it's a whole other section of the power of the culture. And a lot of times I would meet these folks through the audience, and through the audience that would come see our shows, Los Carnales, and then later on to my own band and other bands that we joined. This was always important that they were around, and their voice began to grow too. So it creates a scene, and it's not just musicians hanging out with musicians. It's you have the brown beret guys and ladies, and then you have your musicians, and then you have your promoters. So it's all part of us moving up together. And like anything else, you want everything to be united, and that's not always the way it works, but I mean, you get what you can, and then you move forward with those who see, eye to eye with what you do. And that part of brown power is what I think, where it comes in. It's just that we have to be proud of our identity, know where we come from, and to continue to move forward. We can't stay stuck in something that we didn't live through, you know what I mean? I always say that my music has one foot in the tradition and the other one moving forward. As we grow, we are woven into this American fabric, and we've always been. But we have to know we have to know what we've contributed to it. We have to know how we make it grow. Right. We have to be conscious. We have to say it loud, and we have to teach people that come after us. Like, don't erase the history. Right. Always remember.
So, you mentioned the word history, and that leads me to asking you to talk a little bit about, or as much as you want to, about the Community Collections Grant, which you and Isaac Rodriguez, who's a principal investigator, and
Yeah.
Roberto Rodriguez, and
Yeah.
Jessica
Jessica
Rodriguez.
Valdez, or
Valdez,
Rodriguez, yeah.
Valdez,
Isaac's wife.
that's right. And Angel
Quesada.
and Pat Jasper were
Pat
all
Jasper.
involved in.
Yeah.
So, and how did that come about? Was it just in a matter of Isaac saying, "Hey, I found this cool grant, I should apply for it," or was that something you all consciously came together to shape?
Okay, me and oh, here's a perfect example that takes me back to the last thing I was talking about. Me and Isaac and I met whenever I was in Los Carnales. We were young cats, 19, 20. We're about the same age, back then, or always, right? But I met Isaac. I would run into him at this thing called Party on the Plaza, which was in downtown Houston, in our theater district. I would see Isaac down there, and he'd be like, "You're the only guy I recognize out here. I didn't know you like this stuff." I was like, "I love Tejano music. I can't always tell you what they're singing, but man, I love these rhythms, and this reminds me of, ABC, whatever. It reminds me of stuff I like." So that we would meet at the punk rock shows and the shows I was doing with Los Carnales. Carnales, we would also play punk rock and rockabilly. So there's that element. I left that out. But we played a lot of stuff.
That seems important to mention. Right?
It is very important. Yeah, it's not just ska, I'll tell you that much. Well, Isaac and I we continue to be friends. This is 20-something years now. Well, this whole thing started. Now, we're here at Library of Congress now, right? But this started as Isaac and I starting a two-man DJ group, and we called it Tejas Got Soul. And that's because he was like, "You know what I want? I want to make a little baile. I want to make a dance for the neighborhood. So let's do something in 2nd Ward at one of our favorite hangs. It's called the D&W Lounge. We would pull our vinyl records together that were gifted to us by, I think his tia gave him his first set of Chicano 45s and stuff. And my mom had given me stuff from back in her Pan American days, old first print, Sunny and the Sunliners, Smile Now, Cry Later, all of this stuff. We would get together on his turntables. We'd invite the whole neighborhood out. Tejas Got Soul presents Noches en el Barrio. And people would come out. A lot of old heads would come out. They'd be dancing to these old tunes. Where do you guys learn about this stuff? You always get that, You guys are kind of young to remember this. And they were so happy that we were doing this. And we would do it early enough to get our older audience in. Because then the younger audience would come in later, because we're just naturally going to be more nightlife. There's still partying and stuff. Well, it turned from just the neighborhood to then you'd meet other musicians. Like we met Manuel Mendiola from a band called Manuel Mendiola and the Exiles. Houston musician, Chicano soul. We met Jesse Casas from Jesse and the Crystals. Houston is a very history and plain sight type of city. So some of these guys that are your musical heroes, they live in the neighborhood with you. I used to live down the street from Fito Olivares when I was a kid, who's like the cumbia master from back in the day. He lived down the street. Like when I was gonna go to the store, I would see Fito loading up his bus. Anyway, all that to say, these musicians were just always around us. Isaac and I kept it going. Tejas Got Soul turned 1, 2, 3 years old. Then we started trying to do bigger events. It turned into what is now Sonidos de Houston here at the Library of Congress. That started from a two-man DJ crew that we just kept on at it. After me and Isaac, then the team grew. Pat Jasper came along, a friend of ours, Mary Manning at one point, Angel Quesada doing the video work, doing the editing. And that just kept the movement, the momentum kept going. The more musicians that were coming about. And we have this thing where it's like, man, when people are getting older, you want to catch them one more time. You want to catch them just, can we document something? This is so important. It's about retaining that power, retaining that voice. And sometimes these musicians could otherwise be forgotten or feel forgotten. Well, we are those people that come and go, no, you're not. And this is our responsibility in our culture to do this. We have to document this. So this is what it became. And we look for those figures that were, if they weren't on the stage, they were no less important. But there were other peripheral figures like radio DJs or somebody that worked in the studio or like Lori Maldonado that I interviewed on one of my interviews. She was a central figure in so many parts. Like a lot of these people are like somebody, another part of the movement's Planet X. Like the orbit comes around and everybody knows everybody from back in the day. and they know different record labels, and we make all the connections through these interviews. And it's just funny how interviewing one person, they'll mention somebody else just naturally that you're going to come around and interview again. So that was one of the magical parts about that. But yeah, that's where it started.
I was parsing through the interviews that you all did, I mean, you and your colleagues, and I was trying to think, if you tried to draw like a family tree, like people like drew the connections, it would go off the page somewhere. I mean, it would like end up in different places simply because of all these kinds of connections that you all have, right?
It's true. And the other thing that happens is there's some unlikely connectors in genres. For example, like Chicanos in country music. It's very common. I mean, more common than even on the charts. Like, of course, we have the greats like Freddie Fender, the first Chicano on like a #1 chart, right? Who was recorded by a Cajun producer. So like that's already Gulf Coast just hitting. Right. Well, Freddie Fender recorded Before the Next Teardrop Falls in Southeast Houston at Sugar Hill Studios, which was the same place that Lightning Hopkins would record previous to that, which is the same place that George Jones, Joe Tex, I mean, the Sir Douglas Quintet. The first version of Jolie Blonde by Harry Schultz in 1947 was recorded in Houston. So these things that connect, they're powerful, and they come from, there's all the different genres, like I said. There was a guy named Joey Longoria, his stage name was Joey Long, and he was very much a country musician, but he was a Chicano. And I was in Billy Joe Shaver's band at one point. So drawing this family tree, it's not going to be straight one thing. It's not going to be linear at all. It's going to kind of be spiraling, which is life. So it's very natural. It's very organic. But some of the things that come around are unexpected,
So speaking of unexpected, I was interested, curious, and otherwise fascinated to know what were your kind of aha moments, something that you came across when you were doing these interviews, either for the project or just in the process of discovering music and identity and all of that stands out for you, or more than one, two?
Yeah, sure. Well, one of the cool things, and it brought up a really cool part of our conversation earlier, was Joyce talking about her dad going to play. Like, you hear the stories about the jazz musicians in New York playing uptown but coming downtown to play after the gigs. That's what that sounded like to me. And then it brought in the whole notion of the Port City the special thing about port cities in music. That was a good aha moment with Joyce when she was talking about her family. Because I've known Joyce as a musician. I learned about her father and her uncles and that whole family side of that. Other aha moments were like, there was a guy a good friend of mine that I've known for years. His name is Nestor Aguilar, and he's a member of Los Cardenales now, and he's always been an important part of that band, even though he wasn't a musician in that band for all these years. He's more of a recent addition, last 10 years maybe. The band's been around 30 years. His aha moment for me was he was telling me about his tia in Mexico, who he had the cool tia, who he just like, I just liked being around her, and I liked being in that bar scene, and everything just felt cool, and she turned him on to rock music and stuff. And young Mexicanos picking up on rock music as opposed to the pop stuff that maybe was all over the radio, that was special, because Nestor is a big influence on a lot of people, because he's a messenger. He goes and gathers stuff and he shares it with it. And that's the thing about music. So I've always known that about him. But to hear where he got it from, what influenced Nestor. And that's a really special cat. I mean, he's so involved, and he cares about performance. He cares about the music, cares about the history of it. And he's an encyclopedia. So there's always surprises with him. There's always these little diamonds, Right. When I interviewed Felipe Galvan, he's the leader of Los Cardenales. And I've known him for years and years too, since the late 90s. Well, learning about his upbringing was a cool, I had only touched on it when we were in the same band those years. I guess we were talking about other stuff, but his parents were entertainers, and I knew that much, but I didn't realize that his dad was a drummer in a really important band in Mexico, in Mexican music history, who was a rock and roll band. They were called Los Johnny Jets. So that had a lot to do with Felipe's being such a great frontman that he is, and just such a wealth of knowledge in music. but also his mom was a singer. And I forgot who some of the more famous people that she would be involved with singing when she was a young girl, but he grew up in this culture of music and performing, and when you meet this man, you'll get it, because that's just it just shoots out of him. He's that energy. There were other cool things in the interviews we were doing, like Albert Chavarria, they call him Wizard. He's one of the other guys, and he's one of the guys that I know from like Pasadena, Texas, which is still kind of like the Wild West out there, you know. So well, when you meet some of these old school guys, they're still on the scene, but they've played with bands like Fama, La Fiebre, things like that, the names that we heard in the 80s when Tejano was full swing, when Selena was even still like a young girl, you know, before she became the Selena that is on everybody's t-shirt now. These were the guys that were playing back in those days. I mean, whenever I interviewed, John Barraza, he played in Fama. And funny thing about those interviews that interview with him was he was giving me a little insider stuff on some of the beef they would have, or some of the like friendly competitiveness that they would have with other bands. Right. Some more friendly than others, I'm sure. But these were these funny little anecdotes and stories, because it's you know, while they're in the same business, there's still a little bit of competition. You know, you got a bunch of bulls in the ring, you know, so there's going to be that little fire to it. So it was interesting to see these personal takes on this stuff. Right. And these are all people of different ages, you know. Like, I've known Joyce since I was just old enough to drink, you know what I mean? I remember one of my first bar jobs, Joyce was a bartender there, and I didn't know a thing about Joyce in the context that I do now, and it was all because of this project. So these are people that I've like loved and respected for a long time, but just so many aha moments. I couldn't even keep track of them, but they were wonderful, and they all count so much, and it just really opens all these doors to just show that this timeline, again, is not linear. It spirals, right, and it connects, and it's like looking at a tree in the branches, like, right, you don't know where one begins and where the other ends.
So let me put in a shameless plug for the project that you've done, which is on the Library of Congress website, and you can go see it on Sonidos de Houston, documenting Houston's Chicano music scene.
I love that.
I wanted to ask you, because it seemed to me that, you know, while you're talking about people who are imbued in the music, it doesn't seem to me like folks made their living in music as professionals, as perhaps you and your contemporaries. So right. It seems like they always had to be doing something else. Was that the case?
I feel like that's the case. I feel like I've talked to a few people over the years that were touring, that were on the radio. You know, they were being played on Radio Morales, which is KLVL. That was the first bilingual station, either in the Gulf Coast or in the country. But I won't start lying. But they were being played on the radio, they were touring, and then the story that I would hear a lot, and this happened to a few of them, was that, and I don't know, I giggle because it's like, well, I went to go work for AT&T after that. Like they seem to all go towards Southwestern Bell or something which is probably a solid job back then, telecommunications, of course, right? But, I mean, it was the future. It led us here. But that's the story, is they would tour, they would get their tour and they get their radio play, and I'm just kind of wondering what happened, you know, like, you know, I know every musician has side hustles. We do studio work, we do this, we do that, you know, some of us do more than that, some of us still, you know, do our blue collar work, you know, we're working on cars and plumbing, whatever makes money, right? But I noticed that some of them were not making full livings on that. And of course, the ones that were, I mean, they'll be proud to tell you, you know. But I mean, others would say, no, well, I stopped at a certain point. I was in my 40s and I had to start making money because I had a family. Usually, it involves a family. It involves having kids and being married, you know. So.
But what about, say, the influence of musical genres and styles outside of Houston, like say Mexican radio, you know, that kind of influence coming from, you know, down south? I mean, did that also displace some of these musicians?
I would say so, because I mean, Mexican radio is, you know, and we're slammed right up. I mean, we're in old Mexico, you know, down there. But I think what's playing on the radio and what people are consuming in their media is going to have a large influence on what is selling tickets. And even in an era back then when people were making money off of selling their music and getting radio play, which is not something that happens today, especially in the streaming world. I mean, I feel like that had an impact on a lot of people's, again, regional. They were playing in certain regions where they were good. A Mexican band could go play in Michigan and Wisconsin. You had a lot of Chicanos up there that had probably lived there through the Bracero program way back in the day. You had California. You have everything in Southwest U.S. So you'd think theoretically there's a route. But then the story remains. It's just hard to do anything. It's hard to make a living in music, period. And then of course it's always a bigger team than just the artist, because you need to have somebody that runs that circus, and of course expenses never go away. So I think it's a combination of several elements that are just realistic things like that, and probably obviously when somebody goes and gets another job, it's because it comes down to money. I mean, it's all good to play music, but you got to have somewhere to live and lights and water. So, and feeding babies, of course, and everything else, and growing people, human beings here. So I think that's the case. There's several factors to it, and it always seemed like it come down to that.
No, that's I was just really curious about that, because it seemed to me that one part of this project was to give flowers, I think, as Isaac says, back to those folks who have been sort of shunted aside for various reasons. So to that extent, what has been the reaction of the community with regard to the work that you undertook long ago and then continued on into this particular project? It seems, were there eyes on it?
Oh, there were eyes on it. There were hearts in it. I mean, they were. Manuel Mendiola, a friend of mine, who now a friend, it was somebody I met when we were DJing. He told a whole room full of people, these guys took me out of retirement. And that was such an honor to hear him say that, because I know he loves music, and I know he loves performing it. And everybody in that room knew who he was they remembered him because they would go to his shows. Another person that in a previous situation where we were interviewing was Jesse Casas. Same thing. These people were those bands that were playing at the place that my parents met, the Pan American Ballroom. It was well received. It was well accepted, and then people were just interested, and they wanted to come and tell their stories. See, there was a project we've done before where we offered the audience to come tell stories themselves about back in the day. So the community's into it. And it's hard to collect those stories because people are getting older. People are passing. People have passed. God, if I could have only spoke to this person, that would have been the missing piece in this puzzle. And people have their pictures and their memories. Of course, they have hard copies of this stuff before digital took over. So it's always been received really well. And the neighborhood always appreciates their history. I mean, it's the things that we sit around and talk about for free, casually, over a pint of beer, It's that thing when you knew your neighbor was a musician from back in the day, and you're just dying to ask him questions, and he's dying to talk about it too, because it brings joy. It's something that we all love, is our culture and music. So it's like, it's always a welcome topic, and it's always so well received. People look for it, and there's not always somebody doing what this is doing.
So, I mean, doing those kinds of interviews, that's a full-time job. That's why you had to get a grant. You don't do it in your spare time.
Right.
Do you see people picking up the kind of initiative that you sort of put in motion? Will other people interview their cousins, their neighbors, their tios?
I certainly hope so. It's important to know that, just like they say, it takes a village to raise a child, as the saying is. I mean, it takes a community to keep a community's memory intact, and it's not always going to be from one type of voice, Talk to the bartenders, talk to the promoters, talk to the lady that owned the record shop in San Antonio, talk to Janie, talk to Del Bravo Records, there's so many parts to this community and this puzzle. It's necessary for people to do that, to keep that collective memory going on. And I certainly hope that young people pick up on what we're doing at this age, to then maybe pick up and also keep this party going, Right. Ask us some questions later. We're hopefully we'll live to be old and do the thing too,
Well, so you are now part of this puzzle, have been for a long time,
Yes.
but particularly tonight, you're going to give us a journey back into your history and into your community's history. What can we expect to hear from you tonight? What are you going to be doing?
Oh, that's great. You get to hear my heart. You get to hear my heart sing. I'm so proud of this thing. There's something really special about being able to perform, you know, with people that I really care about, telling my story. And there's something super exciting about my original songs that rope in all of these genres and all of these stories,
Right.
that it brings us together. Again, there's so much more that connects us.
Yeah.
And that's what you can expect tonight. You can also learn of my journey of how I landed from a ska band to being on the country music circuit with
Right.
a songwriting legend, Billy Joe Shaver,
Right.
playing with the greats in country. And what Chicanos do in country is so important too. But we're part of that. We're Americans.
Right.
We're Mexican Americans. We are Americans overall. That's American music that we picked up. We grew up waiting on the Christmas tree. We grew up waiting on our neighbors. We grew up listening to rock and roll. We love the British invasion too. You know, like we love all of that. It's all part of all of us, you know, and you get to see that. And you get to see these great musicians that I have with me on this journey.
Right. All right.
Yeah,
Well,
that's what you get to see.
thank you. I think we probably exhausted your time, and we know you have a gig to get ready for, but is there something that you want to share with us that I haven't asked you about or that comes to mind as we conclude this interview?
I wish I had words for that exactly, but I think the music's going to speak for itself. You're going to love the show. I'll be singing, and my friend Nicolas Valdez, who's super talented, he's going to share some of his original tunes too.
Right.
And then we have some very special medleys that we've composed, that we've curated, let's say, to illustrate that connection on I-10. That connection of the genres and how everything is part of this puzzle. So the show will speak for itself.
Fantastic. So those of you out there in streaming land, look for that coming across your screens just as soon as our wonderful colleagues in MMG, the Multimedia Group, and the Library of Congress can get it up on screen. Thank you, Nick Gaitan, for everything.
Thank you,
and
Guha.
we look forward to it tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's do it.